Hello, and welcome back to the Sleepy Science channel, a place where we take the quiet questions of human experience and unfold them slowly, gently, in the way they were always meant to be understood. Here on Sleepy Science, we have spent many evenings wandering through the past, tracing the long, unhurried thread of human curiosity across centuries and civilizations. Tonight is a little different. Tonight we are not following events or dates. Tonight we are going somewhere softer, somewhere closer to the center of things. Tonight we are going to explore purpose. It is one of the oldest questions a person can carry. Not a question born in a library or a lecture hall, but one that tends to arrive quietly. Sometimes it appears in the long pause between waking and rising in the morning. Sometimes it surfaces on an evening walk when the air is cool and the world feels still. Sometimes it appears without warning in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, and it asks, without apology, "What am I doing here? What is any of this for?" Those questions are not signs that something is wrong. Quite the opposite. They are signs that something is very much alive in you. And tonight, rather than rushing past them or answering them too quickly, we are going to sit with them. We are going to let them breathe. We will move through the science of purpose, what it means, what it does to the brain, how it forms, where it comes from, and why even the quietest and most ordinary life is capable of holding it in great abundance. We will walk through the philosophy of meaning, the psychology of direction, the biology of motivation, and the long, beautiful human tradition of reaching toward something beyond the immediate moment. There is no need to take notes. There is nothing to remember. You only need to settle in, let your breathing slow, and allow these ideas to arrive at whatever pace feels right. So let us begin. Purpose is one of the oldest questions in human history, and it has never had a single answer. For as long as human beings have been capable of reflection, which is to say, for as long as they have been fully human, they have asked what life is for. This is not a modern anxiety born from comfort or boredom. It is something far more ancient. Archaeologists have found evidence of burial practices dating back over 100,000 years, in which the dead were placed carefully, with flowers, with tools, with objects that suggest the living believed the deceased were going somewhere with meaning. That impulse to frame existence as purposeful, to believe that life has direction, appears to be one of the most fundamental features of the human mind. It cuts across every culture that has ever existed. The Sumerians wrote about it in clay tablets 4,000 years ago. The ancient Egyptians built entire systems of belief around the idea that a life must be weighted against a feather at its end, and that only a life lived well, a life of meaning, would pass. The ancient Greeks named purpose with a word that has never been improved upon, telos, the end toward which something tends, the natural direction of a thing fully becoming itself. A seed, the Greek philosophers argued, has telos. Its purpose is written into its nature, to grow, to flower, to fruit, and a human being, they believed, has telos too. The question was simply discovering what it was. That question has occupied thinkers in every generation since. And what is remarkable across all those centuries and all those different cultures is not how different the answers have been, but how similar. Over and over again, human beings have arrived at the same general cluster of answers. Purpose seems to live in connection, in contribution, in growth, in love, in the sense that one's presence in the world makes some kind of difference, however small, however quiet, however invisible to anyone else. Tonight, we will explore all of that, but we begin here, in the recognition that you are not alone in asking these questions. Every human being who has ever lived has asked them, in some form, at some point. The question is not a flaw. It is a gift. The human brain is specifically built to seek meaning, not just sensation. For a long time, early science assumed that the primary driver of human behavior was the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. The brain, in this view, was essentially a reward-seeking machine. Find food, find safety, find warmth, repeat, and there is truth in that. The brain's reward systems are ancient and powerful. When you eat something delicious, when you feel the warmth of the sun on your skin, when you rest after physical effort, your brain releases dopamine, a neurotransmitter associated with anticipation and reward. Those systems are real and they matter. But they are not the whole story, not even close. Neuroscientists studying the brain in more recent decades have found something extraordinary. The same regions of the brain that activate during experiences of physical pleasure also activate during experiences of meaning. When people feel that what they are doing matters, when they are engaged in something that connects to their values, their relationships, their sense of who they are, the brain lights up in ways that overlap significantly with its response to physical reward. This means that meaning is not a luxury layered on top of the basic machinery of survival. It is woven into the machinery itself. The brain does not simply want comfort, it wants context. It wants to understand why it is doing what it is doing. It wants a story that makes sense. Researchers have studied what happens to people who are given everything they need for physical comfort, but deprived of meaningful occupation or social connection. The results are consistent and striking. Even when all physical needs are met, the absence of meaning creates a kind of suffering that is genuine, measurable, and sometimes profound. People in these conditions often describe a flatness to experience, a grayness, a sense that the days are passing but not accumulating into anything. This is not weakness. It is simply the brain doing what it was built to do. It is asking for something it genuinely needs. The philosopher Aristotle believed that purpose was not invented but discovered. This is one of the most comforting ideas in the long history of thinking about meaning. Aristotle, who lived in ancient Greece some 350 years before the Common Era, did not believe that human beings create their purpose from scratch, the way an architect designs a building from nothing. He believed that purpose was something more like a natural inclination, something already present in a person's nature, waiting to be recognized and cultivated. He called this eudaimonia. It is often translated as happiness, but that translation falls slightly short. A better approximation might be flourishing, or perhaps thriving. Eudaimonia, for Aristotle, was the condition of a person living in full accordance with their deepest nature, using their capacities, growing toward their potential, engaged with the world in ways that were genuinely expressive of who they were. This is a meaningful distinction because it changes the nature of the search. If purpose must be invented from nothing, the task can feel enormous and somewhat arbitrary. Any direction would be equally valid, and the sheer number of possibilities can be paralyzing. But if purpose is discovered, if it is something already present, already pointing somewhere, already whispering in the things you find yourself drawn to, the things that make time disappear, the things you return to again and again, without quite being able to explain why, then the task becomes quieter, gentler, more like listening than constructing. Aristotle believed that a person's natural capacities, the things they do well almost without effort, the inclinations that have always been present, the ways of engaging with the world that feel natural and right, were the fingerprints of their telos, their purpose, the direction toward which they were, by nature, inclined to grow. You may have experienced something like this. A moment when you were doing something, and you thought, without quite meaning to, this is what I am supposed to be doing. Not because someone told you so, not because it was practical or profitable, but because it felt deeply, quietly, unmistakably right. That feeling is not a fantasy. Aristotle would have said it was information. The Japanese concept of Ikigai offers one of the most quietly powerful frameworks for understanding purpose. The word Ikigai comes from the Japanese language and is often translated as a reason for being. It is a concept that has been woven into Japanese culture for centuries, but it gained wider international attention in recent decades as psychologists and researchers began studying the people of certain regions of Japan, particularly the Okinawan Islands, who consistently lived longer, healthier, and apparently happier lives than almost anyone else on Earth. Researchers were curious about what these communities were doing differently. They studied their diets, their social habits, their sleep, their exercise, their relationship to work. And one of the factors that emerged again and again in interviews and in observation was this: the people in these communities had and could articulate a clear sense of Ikigai. They knew, in a quiet and unhurried way, what they were here for. They had a reason to get up in the morning that was genuinely their own. The concept of Ikigai, as it has been explored and adapted in recent years, is often illustrated as 4 overlapping circles. The first circle contains what you love, the activities and engagements that bring you genuine joy and aliveness. The second contains what you are good at, the natural and cultivated capacities that come to you with a degree of ease. The third contains what the world needs, the gaps in the lives of others that you are positioned by your nature and abilities to help address. And the fourth contains what you can be sustained by the things that can support your life in a practical sense. Where all 4 circles overlap is, according to this framework, where Ikigai lives. What is striking about this is not any single circle. It is the overlap. It is the recognition that a truly sustaining sense of purpose tends to involve more than one of these dimensions. A person who does only what they love but contributes nothing to others may experience pleasure, but something hollow persists. A person who does only what they are good at but loves none of it may be productive, but drained. A person who gives generously to what the world needs but neglects their own natural inclinations may eventually exhaust themselves. But where love and skill and contribution and sustainability coincide, where you are doing something you enjoy, doing it well, offering it to others, and being able to sustain yourself in the process, that is the sweet, quiet center of Ikigai. And here is the part that tends to bring people a kind of relief. Ikigai is not always grand. It is not reserved for artists and explorers and revolutionary thinkers. For many Okinawans studied by researchers, their Ikigai was tending a small garden, or cooking traditional food for their family, or being the person in their community who remembered the old songs, small things, ordinary things, things that fit the shape of their particular life. That is the point. Ikigai is not about scale. It is about fit. Research shows that a sense of purpose is associated with longer life and better physical health. This is one of the most surprising and consistently replicated findings in the psychology of well-being. For decades, researchers assumed that the relationship between mental states and physical health was fairly omnidirectional, that if your body was healthy, you would feel better emotionally, but that your emotional state had limited power to influence your physical health beyond basic things like stress reduction. That assumption has been substantially revised. A major study, published in a prominent psychological journal, followed more than 6,000 adults over 14 years and found that those who reported a stronger sense of purpose in their lives had significantly lower rates of mortality. Over the period of the study, even after controlling for other health factors, the relationship was not small, it was substantial. People with high purpose scores were more than twice as likely to still be alive at the end of the study period compared to those with the lowest purpose scores. Other studies have found that a strong sense of purpose is associated with reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, lower rates of cognitive decline in aging, better immune function, reduced levels of inflammatory markers in the blood, better sleep quality, and faster recovery from illness. The mechanisms through which these effects operate are still being studied, but researchers believe that several pathways are likely involved. People with a strong sense of purpose tend to engage more consistently in health-promoting behaviors. They exercise more, sleep better, maintain social connections more reliably, and are more likely to seek medical care when needed. They also appear to handle stress differently. The same stressor encountered by a person with a clear sense of purpose and a person without one tends to register differently, not necessarily as less stressful, but as more manageable, as something that can be moved through rather than something that simply happens to you. There is also evidence that purpose affects the body through the endocrine and immune systems in ways that are not fully explained by behavior alone. Something deeper seems to be at work. As though the body, informed by the mind's sense of direction and worth, is able to allocate its resources differently. The findings are striking enough that some healthcare systems have begun asking patients about purpose as part of routine well-being assessments. Not because purpose is a substitute for medicine, but because it turns out to be genuinely relevant to health in ways that were previously underestimated. Viktor Frankl survived the unimaginable and found that meaning was stronger than circumstance. Viktor Frankl was an Austrian psychiatrist and neurologist who was taken to the concentration camps of the Second World War in the early 1940s. He survived. Much of his family did not. He spent years in 4 different camps, including Auschwitz, under conditions of extreme deprivation, brutality, and loss. What emerged from his observations, both of himself and of his fellow prisoners, became one of the most influential books ever written about the human capacity to endure. He published it after the war, under the title Man's Search for Meaning. It has sold tens of millions of copies in dozens of languages and continues to be read today. Frankl's central observation was this: that even in conditions stripped of almost every external source of comfort, dignity, and hope, a person who retained a sense of inner meaning, a reason to survive, a future to move toward, a sense that their suffering had some context or consequence, was more likely to endure than a person who had lost all such orientation. He described watching prisoners in the camps. He saw men and women who had lost every external possession, every relationship, every physical comfort. But he noticed that some still maintained something the conditions could not take, a sense that their life still had a direction, still had something to offer, still had something worth surviving for. He saw others lose that thread, and he observed, with the clinical eye of a psychiatrist, that the loss of meaning preceded other forms of collapse: physical, emotional, relational. Not always. Nothing is simple in extremity. But, consistently enough to form an observation, he spent the rest of his life developing. His conclusion was not comfortable. He did not suggest that meaning makes suffering disappear, or that a positive attitude can overcome any circumstance. He was too honest for that. What he suggested instead was that the capacity to find meaning, even in suffering, even in irreversible loss, even in limitation, is one of the deepest freedoms available to a human being, and that this freedom, unlike most others, cannot be taken away by any external force. He called this the last of the human freedoms, the freedom to choose your attitude in any given set of circumstances. Frankl's work gave rise to a school of therapy he called logotherapy, therapy through meaning. It was one of the first therapeutic approaches to place meaning-making, rather than symptom reduction or behavior change, at the center of psychological healing. His ideas continue to influence psychology, philosophy, and pastoral care around the world today. The difference between pleasure and meaning is subtle but profound. Pleasure and meaning are related, but they are not the same thing. Understanding the distinction and the relationship between them is one of the more important things research on human well-being has uncovered. Pleasure refers to states of enjoyment, comfort, and positive sensation. Eating something delicious is pleasant. Resting after effort is pleasant. Physical warmth is pleasant. These experiences are real and valuable. They are part of a full life. There is nothing to be suspicious of in pleasure. But pleasure is also typically brief, self-focused, and dependent on external conditions. When the pleasant experience ends, the pleasure ends. And research shows that humans are remarkably poor at predicting how long pleasurable experiences will actually make them feel good, a phenomenon psychologists call hedonic adaptation. We tend to return fairly quickly to our emotional baseline after positive events, just as we return to it after negative ones. Meaning is different in character. Meaning tends to arise from activities and experiences that involve connection to something beyond oneself, other people, a purpose, a community, a project, a value. It often involves effort and sometimes even sacrifice. It is frequently not pleasant in the immediate moment. A parent caring for a sick child at 3 a.m. is not having a pleasant experience. But most parents would describe that period of their life as deeply meaningful. Research by psychologists studying the distinction between what they call the pleasant life and the meaningful life found something striking. People who described their lives as primarily oriented toward pleasure reported higher levels of moment-to-moment positive emotion, but also higher levels of worry and stress, and a somewhat shallow relationship with their own experience. People who described their lives as primarily oriented toward meaning reported somewhat lower moment-to-moment positive emotion, but also greater resilience, deeper relationships, stronger sense of self, and higher overall life satisfaction. The happiest people in the most robust studies are not those who pursue only pleasure or only meaning, but those who have both and who have some sense of how the two relate in their particular life. Children show signs of purposeful behavior long before they can name or describe it. This is one of the more charming areas of developmental psychology. For a long time, researchers assumed that purpose was a relatively lately developing psychological capacity, something that emerged in adolescence or adulthood. Once a person had accumulated enough experience to form a meaningful sense of identity and direction, more recent research has complicated that picture in interesting ways. Studies of very young children, toddlers and preschoolers reveal that even at the age of 2 and 3, children show a striking preference for activities that they believe contribute to something beyond themselves. In one famous experiment, young children were given the choice between performing a task simply for their own benefit and performing the same task to help an adult achieve a goal. Even when the self-beneficial task was equally available and equally rewarding in other respects, most children reliably chose the pro-social option, the one that helped another person. This preference for contribution appears to be built into human nature very early. Children do not need to be taught to want to be helpful. They arrive with it. The capacity for purpose, or at least for the pro-social impulses that purpose most often draws upon, appears to be part of the original human equipment. Researchers have also observed that children as young as 3 begin to construct what psychologists call personal projects, small ongoing narratives of effort and intention that give coherence and direction to their behavior. A child who decides she is going to build a tower and who returns to that project over multiple days is engaging in rudimentary, purposeful behavior. She has a direction. She is working toward something. And researchers have observed that even at this early age, the sense of engaging in a project of being in progress toward a meaningful goal generates measurable positive affect that is distinct from the pleasure of any single activity. Purpose, in other words, is not something we develop. It is something we refine, something we clarify and deepen over time. But the root of it is there from the beginning. The body holds the experience of purpose in physical ways. When people are engaged in activities they find purposeful, the changes in their physiology are measurable and significant. The breath deepens, the shoulders drop, muscle tension decreases. Cortisol levels, the body's primary stress hormone, tend to fall. The heart rate stabilizes into what researchers call a more coherent pattern. This is not simply relaxation. It is a specific kind of embodied engagement that is different from both rest and from anxious effort. It has some qualities of rest, the absence of defensive tension, combined with some qualities of effort, increased blood flow to the areas of the brain involved in sustained attention and creative problem solving. Some researchers have described it as a state of alert, ease, present, awake, but not clenched. You may have felt this in your own body at some point. The quality of absorption that happens when you are doing something that genuinely matters to you, something you are good at, something that connects to your values, something that requires real engagement, and the hours pass and you look up and are faintly surprised that so much time has gone. That state of absorption, which psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi famously named flow, is a physiological state as much as a psychological one. And it tends to arise most reliably when the activity in question is one that a person experiences as personally meaningful. The connection between purpose and physical ease is not coincidental. It appears to reflect something true about how the human body is designed to operate. It functions best, in the deepest physiological sense, when it is directed towards something it believes in. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche wrote that a person who has a why to live can bear almost any how. This line, more complex and more earned in its context than it is sometimes understood to be, comes from one of the most provocative and difficult thinkers of the 19th century. Nietzsche was not a gentle philosopher. His work is demanding and often unsettling, but on the question of purpose, he arrived at something that resonates deeply with everything research has subsequently found. A why, in Nietzsche's sense, is not a simple goal or a pleasant ambition. It is something more fundamental. It is an orientation, a direction in which one is genuinely, deeply committed to moving. A reason that is integrated into one's sense of self and value at a level deep enough that it can provide stabilizing force in difficult conditions. A person who has this kind of why, Nietzsche argued, can absorb an enormous range of difficulty, hardship, loss, frustration, delay, failure, without losing their fundamental orientation. Because the why is not dependent on conditions going well, it is a compass, not a destination. It tells you which way to face, and as long as you know which way to face, you can keep moving, regardless of the terrain. Viktor Frankl quoted this line in Man's Search for Meaning. He had found it to be true in conditions Nietzsche never faced, and in placing it at the heart of his work, he gave it a weight and a verification that transformed it from philosophical assertion into something closer to observed fact. The power of a why to sustain movement through difficult circumstances is one of the most consistently supported findings in both psychology and neuroscience. People with a strong sense of purpose demonstrate greater persistence in the face of obstacles. They are more likely to recover from setbacks. They show what researchers call greater psychological flexibility, the ability to adapt their strategies while maintaining their fundamental direction. Many people find that purpose arrives not all at once, but in fragments, over time. One of the things that makes conversations about purpose sometimes feel exhausting rather than energizing is the implicit expectation that it should arrive as a revelation, a single, clear, complete answer to the question of what your life is for, delivered in a moment of clarity and then maintained ever after in its entirety. That is not how purpose typically works, and recognizing this can be a significant relief. For most people, purpose is something that accumulates. It is built up gradually from a series of smaller recognitions moments when something felt right, when an activity or a connection or a contribution lit something up in you, when you thought, more of this. It is refined through experience, through loss, through failure, through the things that taught you what you did not want and therefore clarified what you did. Research following people across their lifetimes finds that sense of purpose tends to deepen and become more specific with age, not necessarily because older people have found answers that younger ones are missing, but because they have more data, more experience of themselves in different conditions, more evidence of what sustains them and what depletes them, more confidence in their own inner signals. Young people often feel a pressure around purpose that is in some ways premature. They are asked, sometimes from a very early age, to name their purpose in terms of a career or a life plan, as though purpose were primarily a vocational question. What will you do with your life, rather than a relational and experiential one? What kind of person are you becoming, and what matters most to you as you become it? This conflation of purpose with career is understandable but limiting. Purpose, as psychologists have studied it, is a much broader and more personal thing than what you do for work. Some people find their deepest sense of purpose in their professional life. Some find it in their relationships. Some find it in creative practice, in community engagement, in spiritual life, in the quiet stewardship of land or tradition or culture. Some find it woven through all of these things in a way that resists any single label. The point is not to find the right category. The point is to find the right fit and to trust that the search itself, conducted with honesty and patience, will eventually bring you closer to it. Research into what makes work meaningful reveals that it is rarely about the work itself. This is one of the more counterintuitive findings in the psychology of occupational meaning. You might expect that meaningful work would be, by definition, objectively important work, work that clearly and obviously contributes to something significant. And there is some truth to that. Studies do find that people who work in professions they believe contribute to the well-being of others tend to report higher levels of meaning on average. But the relationship is far from simple, and the most interesting findings come from looking at what actually differentiates a meaningful experience from an unmeaningful one, even within the same job. One influential body of research followed hospital custodians, people employed to clean and maintain hospital wards. On the surface, this might not seem like a profession, particularly associated with a deep sense of purpose. But the researchers found something remarkable. Some of these custodians described their work in purely transactional terms. They came in, did their tasks, and left. Others described something entirely different. They spoke of their role as part of the healing environment of the hospital. They described small acts of care they performed that were not in their job description, chatting with patients who seemed lonely, timing their cleaning to avoid disturbing patients who were resting, learning the stories of the people on the wards. They had, essentially, reframed their role from custodian to caregiver, and their experience of their work was transformed. The researchers called this process job crafting, the active, informal reshaping of one's role around one's own sense of what matters. And they found that people who engaged in job crafting reported dramatically higher levels of engagement, satisfaction, and sense of meaning, even when their actual job title and tasks were identical to those of colleagues who did not craft their work in this way. The lesson is not that any job can be made meaningful with the right attitude that would be both naive and unkind to people in genuinely dehumanizing conditions. The lesson is that meaning, even in work, is substantially created through relationship, through the connections we form, and the ways we understand our contribution in context. The meaning does not live primarily in the task. It lives in the web of relationships and intentions through which the task is performed. The Stoic philosophers of ancient Greece and Rome believed that purpose was found in virtue, not circumstance. The Stoics, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and others developed one of the most durable and practically applicable philosophies of purpose in the ancient world. Their core insight was simple and radically liberating. You cannot control what happens to you, but you can always control how you respond to it. And the quality of your response, its alignment with your deepest values, is the truest expression of who you are. Marcus Aurelius was, by any external measure, one of the most powerful men in the ancient world. He was emperor of Rome for nearly 20 years during the 2nd century. He commanded armies, administered an empire, and navigated the complex and often brutal politics of one of the largest states ever assembled. And yet, in his private journals, never intended for publication, known to us as the Meditations, he wrote not about power or glory or achievement, but about the ongoing, daily, often difficult practice of acting in accordance with his values. He returned again and again to the same themes: the importance of honesty, of fairness, of attending genuinely to what is in front of you, of doing the thing that needs to be done, without drama or complaint or the need for recognition. He wrote about purpose not as something you discover once and then possess, but as something you practice continuously in every small action of every day. This view of purpose as practice rather than possession is one that resonates with a great deal of contemporary psychological research. The sense of meaning that people report is not something that appears once and remains stable thereafter. It is something that requires ongoing cultivation. It must be watered, to continue the metaphor, tended, lived into, day after day, in the small moments as much as the large ones. The Stoics would have recognized immediately the findings of positive psychologists who report that people experience higher levels of meaning not through grand gestures and peak experiences alone, but through the accumulation of small, aligned actions, small acts of kindness, small moments of genuine presence, small choices made in accordance with one's deepest values, each one tiny on its own. Together, over time, they compose a life. The idea of calling has appeared in almost every culture and spiritual tradition throughout history. Across an enormous range of spiritual traditions, cultural frameworks, and historical periods, human beings have used a particular kind of language to describe a certain quality of purposeful experience. They have spoken of being called, of having a vocation, of hearing a voice not always literally, but in the metaphorical sense of an inner orientation that feels as though it comes from somewhere beyond ordinary preference and desire. The word vocation itself comes from the Latin vocare, meaning to call. In its original medieval European context, it referred specifically to a divine calling, the sense that God had intended a particular person for a particular role or way of life. But the experience it describes, the felt sense of an inner summons toward a particular direction, appears to be far broader than any single theological framework. Indigenous cultures around the world speak of finding one's purpose through vision, through dream, through the guidance of elders who recognize gifts in a young person before that person can recognize them in themselves. African philosophical traditions describe the purpose of a person in relational terms. You are what you are, partly through others, and your purpose is inseparable from your responsibility to the community that holds you. Buddhist traditions describe the practice of finding one's dharma, one's own natural right path through sustained attention and the quiet dissolution of the ego's noise. What all of these traditions share is the conviction that purpose is not primarily something one manufactures through will and effort. It is something one listens for. It requires a certain quality of inner quiet, an ability to be still enough to distinguish genuine inner signals from the noise of anxiety, expectation, and the desire to please others. This is one reason why so many traditions associate the search for purpose with practices of contemplation, silence, and solitude. Not because purpose is found only in the absence of other people, but because the listening required to recognize it is a subtle skill, one that tends to be drowned out by constant activity and noise. Boredom, when examined carefully, can be a compass pointing toward purpose. This might seem counterintuitive. Boredom is commonly experienced as an absence, an emptiness of engagement, a flatness of experience, a wanting something that has no particular shape. It is not typically thought of as useful information, but psychologists who study boredom have found that it is actually a highly specific signal from the mind. It is not the absence of desire. It is the presence of a desire that is not being met specifically, the desire for meaningful engagement. Boredom, in this view, is what happens when the mind is capable of more meaningful engagement than the current situation is providing. It is a signal that something in you is underused, that a capacity or an inclination is not being expressed, that the current activity or circumstance is not, as the mind experiences it, adequate to what you actually are. This framing transforms boredom from something to escape into something to investigate. Rather than immediately reaching for a distraction when boredom arrives, the phone, the television, the task that keeps your hands busy but leaves your mind vacant, there is value in pausing and asking, what is this boredom pointing away from? And what might it be pointing toward? Research into creative achievement has consistently found that boredom is a frequent precursor to genuine creative insight. People who allow themselves to be bored, who resist immediately filling the emptiness with distraction, show higher rates of creative problem-solving and generate more novel ideas than those who habitually avoid experience. This is because the mind, when given space, tends to orient itself toward its own genuine interests. The daydreaming that accompanies boredom is not mindlessness. It is the mind searching for something. And what it searches for, in the absence of external demand, tends to reveal something true about what genuinely engages and animates it. Research finds that relationships are the most consistently cited source of meaning across cultures. Of all the things that people point to when they describe what gives their life meaning, relationship is the most universal. When researchers ask people in different countries, from different cultural and socio-economic backgrounds, to describe the sources of meaning in their lives, the responses vary enormously in their specifics, but across all of them, connection with others appears at or near the top of almost every list. This is true in individualist Western cultures and in collectivist Eastern ones. It is true among people who are highly religious and those who are not. It is true among people who find their primary purpose in work, in creative practice, in community engagement, or in nature. Whatever else generates meaning in a particular person's life, relationships tend to be present. This is consistent with what we know about human evolution. The human species is among the most intensely social mammals on Earth. Our survival, for the vast majority of our evolutionary history, depended entirely on our membership in a community. We are not built for solitude. We are built for belonging. And the sense of belonging, the sense of being known and valued by others, of mattering to the people who matter to you, appears to be one of the most fundamental ingredients of a meaningful life. Harvard researchers conducting what has become one of the longest studies of adult development ever completed, spanning nearly 80 years, and following participants across their entire adult lives, reached a conclusion that is, in retrospect, beautifully unsurprising. The single most consistent predictor of healthy aging, life satisfaction, and a sense that one's life had been well lived was not wealth or achievement, or health status, or any external marker of success. It was the quality of one's close relationships. Not the number of relationships, not their social prestige or their practical utility. Simply their quality. The degree of warmth, honesty, and genuine mutual care they contained. The researchers described this finding as both simple and surprising. Surprising because it ran counter to what their participants and American culture more broadly tended to assume about what constituted a successful life. Simple because, once stated, it seems almost too obvious to require a multi-decade study to discover. Meaning and purpose tend to deepen through difficulty, not despite it. This is one of the most consistently reported findings among people who reflect seriously on their own experience of meaning over time. The periods of life that are remembered as most meaningful are frequently also among the most difficult. The years of raising small children through illness and sleeplessness and constant uncertainty. The sustained effort of building something that might fail. The long companionship of a loved one through serious illness. The slow and painful work of repairing something important that was broken. These are not primarily pleasant experiences in the ordinary sense. And yet, when people are asked to identify the periods of their lives that felt most meaningful, most alive, most worth having lived, they return again and again to precisely these kinds of experiences. Researchers call this the dark side of meaning, and they are not using the phrase negatively. They use it to describe the paradox that some of the most meaningful experiences of a human life are found not in comfort and ease, but in sustained and loving engagement with difficulty. This does not mean that suffering is automatically meaningful or that difficulty is inherently good. Suffering without meaning is simply suffering. The distinction lies in whether the difficulty is understood in context, whether it is connected to something the person values, engaged with in accordance with their deepest commitments, and held within a narrative that gives it shape and significance. A parent who is exhausted by the demands of caring for their child is not experiencing a pleasant situation, but if that parent understands what they are doing, if they feel connected to the purpose of their care, if they are doing it out of love for someone who matters to them, if they can see it as part of a larger story they are telling with their life, the difficulty becomes something other than simply difficult. It becomes meaningful difficult. And that distinction, as any psychologist who studies the subject will tell you, makes an enormous difference to how the experience is held and what it ultimately leaves behind. The philosopher Simone Weil wrote about attention as one of the purest forms of love and one of the deepest sources of meaning. Simone Weil was a French philosopher, mystic, and political activist who lived in the first half of the 20th century. She was an extraordinary thinker, severe in her demands on herself, deeply compassionate in her response to the suffering of others, and possessed of an unusual ability to synthesize philosophical, spiritual, and political insight into something that feels, even decades after her death, alive and urgent. One of her central ideas was that genuine attention, the capacity to truly attend to another person, to a problem, to a piece of reality, without distorting it with one's own desires, fears, and preconceptions, was a form of love, and that the practice of this attention was both the source and the expression of a deeply meaningful life. Weil was not speaking of ordinary attention in the sense of paying attention during a meeting or focusing on a task. She was speaking of something more radical, the willingness to set aside one's own agenda long enough to actually perceive what is in front of you, to see the person you are talking with as they actually are, rather than as a projection of your expectations, to perceive a problem in its actual complexity rather than filtering it through the categories that would make it more comfortable. This quality of attention Weil believed, was profoundly rare, and it was profoundly valuable both to the person receiving it and to the person practicing it. To be truly seen by another person is one of the most meaningful experiences available to a human being, and to truly see another person, to offer them the gift of genuine, unselfing attention, is one of the most meaningful things a human being can do. What is striking about this idea is that it locates purpose not in grand gestures or exceptional circumstances, but in the quality of ordinary presence, in how you listen during a conversation, in how you look at the person in front of you, in whether you are actually there, in each moment, or somewhere else entirely. This resonates with a great deal of what we know about what makes relationships feel meaningful and sustaining. People do not generally report that what they value most in their close relationships is grand gestures or exceptional experiences. They report that what they value most is feeling genuinely seen, heard, attended to, present in someone's awareness in a real way, rather than a peripheral or transactional one. Purpose, in this view, is practiced moment to moment in the quality of attention we bring to whatever is in front of us. Some research suggests that knowing your values is more important than knowing your goals. Goals are often where people begin when they think about purpose. What do I want to achieve? Where do I want to be in 5 years? What would make me feel successful? These are not bad questions, but research suggests that they may be second-order questions, questions whose answers depend on a deeper and more primary form of self-knowledge. Values are the deeper layer. They are the things that matter to you for their own sake, independent of any particular outcome. Honesty, creativity, connection, growth, adventure, care for others, contribution to a community, the experience of beauty, the pursuit of justice. Whatever yours are, and they vary considerably between people, they are the organizing principles of a genuinely meaningful life. When people are clear about their values, they have an internal compass that works regardless of which particular direction their life takes. They can evaluate opportunities, navigate uncertainty, respond to change, and absorb setbacks without losing their fundamental orientation, because their fundamental orientation is not tied to any specific goal or circumstance, but to a way of being in the world that is genuinely their own. When people are unclear about their values, or when they are living in ways that contradict them, pursuing goals that were never really theirs, meeting external expectations at the cost of internal coherence, the experience can be one of a peculiar dissatisfaction that is hard to name. Everything looks right from the outside. The achievements are there. The markers of success are in place. But something is off. Something is missing. And it is very often the case that what is missing is simple alignment, the quiet harmony of living in accordance with what genuinely matters to you. Research into values clarity finds that people who are clear about their core values make better decisions under pressure, experience less decisional regret over time, and report higher levels of meaning and life satisfaction, regardless of their external circumstances or the particular outcomes they achieve. This does not mean that goals are unimportant. It means that the best goals are those grown from genuinely understood values, goals that serve the values, express them, move in their direction. When goals and values are aligned, the pursuit of a goal is itself a meaningful activity, independent of the outcome. The concept of legacy has shaped human motivation across thousands of years and thousands of cultures. Among the most powerful drivers of purposeful action is the desire to leave something behind, to make a contribution that will outlast one's own life, however small, however quiet, however invisible to everyone outside a small circle. This desire appears to be one of the most universal features of human motivation. Psychologist Erik Erikson, who developed an influential theory of human development across the lifespan, identified what he called generativity. the drive to create and establish things that will outlast the individual as a central developmental task of middle adulthood. And his research found that people who were able to engage meaningfully with this drive to find genuine ways to contribute to the next generation, whether through parenting, mentoring, creating, teaching, or caring for things that will endure, tended to thrive in older adulthood with a strong sense of meaning and integration, while those who were blocked from it or disengaged from it tended toward what Erickson called stagnation. The desire for legacy is not vanity, though it can become vanity when distorted. At its root, it is something much more basic, the desire to matter, to have one's time here mean something, to be part of a story that does not end when one's own chapter does. This desire is visible everywhere in human history, in the care that parents and grandparents and teachers put into the generations that follow them, in the buildings that great civilizations raised not purely for practical use, but because they wanted to leave something that would endure, in the stories and songs that have been passed down through countless generations, carefully preserved and carried forward, not because the people who preserved them thought anyone would necessarily value them, but because they believed they were worth saving. The stones at Stonehenge were placed by people whose names we will never know, in a configuration that required enormous collective effort over a very long period of time. We do not know exactly what they intended, but they intended something. They were oriented toward a purpose that extended beyond any single lifetime. They were doing something for the future, even though they had no way of knowing what that future would hold, or whether anyone in it would understand what they had made. That impulse, the desire to make something that outlasts you, to contribute to a story larger than your own, is one of the most specifically human things about us, and it continues to shape human motivation today, in forms both grand and intimate. Neurological research has found a link between the clarity of personal purpose and reduced anxiety. One of the less obvious benefits of a clear sense of purpose, from a neurological perspective, is its effect on anxiety. This relationship has been documented in research, but is not always intuitive. You might expect that a person with strong purpose would actually feel more anxious, more invested in outcomes, more concerned about success and failure. What researchers find is generally the opposite. People with a strong, clear sense of personal purpose tend to show lower baseline levels of anxiety, even when they are engaged in high-stakes activities. And they tend to recover more quickly from acute periods of stress. The mechanism appears to involve what researchers call self-coherence, the degree to which a person's actions, values, relationships, and sense of identity are felt as consistent and integrated. When these elements are aligned, when you are doing what you value, in relationship with people who matter to you, in ways that feel genuinely expressive of who you are, the brain's threat detection systems, which are closely associated with anxiety, appear to operate at a lower level of background activation. Anxiety, in this neurological framing, is in part a signal of uncertainty and incoherence. It is the brain's way of saying, something here does not fit. I am not sure where I am going. I am not sure what I am supposed to be doing. I am not sure this is safe. A clear sense of purpose provides context and coherence that reduces the frequency of these signals, not by eliminating uncertainty. Purpose does not make life predictable, but by providing a stable orientation from which uncertainty can be navigated. People with clear purpose are not less aware of uncertainty. They are less threatened by it, because they know where they are pointing, even when they do not know exactly what is coming. And knowing where you are pointing, it turns out, is one of the most calming things a nervous system can know. Throughout history, the most enduring forms of human creativity have been animated by something beyond personal ambition. When you look at the great creative works of human civilization, the ones that have endured, that have moved and illuminated people across very different times and cultures, a pattern often emerges. The people who made them were usually not, in the moments of their making, primarily concerned with fame or posterity. They were concerned with getting something right, with expressing something true, with serving something they believed in. Johann Sebastian Bach, who composed some of the most profound music ever written, concluded many of his manuscripts with the initials S, D, G, Soli, Deo, Gloria, to God alone, the glory. Whatever one thinks of the theology, the sentiment is revealing. The music was not for him. It was in service of something he believed in. He was a craftsman of the transcendent, and the transcendent he served gave his work a quality that work done purely for recognition rarely achieves. The people who built the great medieval cathedrals of Europe, many of whom spent their entire working lives contributing to structures they would never see completed, were animated by a purpose that vastly exceeded their individual spans. They were not building for themselves. They were building for God, for their community, for the centuries. Their names are mostly unknown. Their work still stands. The scientists who have made the most enduring contributions to human understanding, the ones whose work has genuinely changed what it is possible to know, have almost uniformly described themselves not as pursuing recognition, but as being drawn by curiosity, by the desire to understand something, by the sense that there was a truth to be found, and that finding it would matter. This pattern is not a coincidence. It reflects something important about the relationship between purpose and quality. Work done in service of something genuinely believed in tends to be done differently, with a kind of care, a willingness to get it right over getting it done, an attentiveness that work done purely for external reward rarely sustains over time. The neuroscience of flow reveals what the brain looks like when purpose and action are perfectly aligned. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, a Hungarian-American psychologist who spent most of his career studying optimal human experience, described the state of flow as one of the defining features of a meaningful life. He arrived at the concept through decades of interviews and research, asking people when they felt most alive, most engaged, most fully themselves. What emerged was a surprisingly consistent picture. People described states of deep absorption in which time seemed to change its texture. Self-consciousness fell away, action felt effortless and precise, and the activity itself seemed to generate a kind of intrinsic reward that was independent of any external outcome. They described these states during surgeries, during musical performance, during athletic achievement, during intense creative work, during deep conversation, during skilled craftsmanship. The common features were a challenge that matched the skill level of the performer, a clear sense of what was required in each moment, immediate feedback that allowed continuous adjustment, and deep personal investment in the activity itself. What was striking was the consistency of the experience across wildly different domains. The surgeon in flow and the musician in flow and the carpenter in flow were describing something that felt essentially the same. And neurological research has since confirmed that the brain states associated with flow are indeed remarkably consistent across different types of activity. In flow, the prefrontal cortex, the region most associated with self-monitoring, self-criticism, and rumination, shows reduced activation. Self-consciousness, in the ordinary sense, quiets down. Attention becomes focused and absorbed. The body and the mind function together efficiently and with unusual precision. People who experience flow regularly report that these experiences are among the most meaningful of their lives, more memorable, more valued, more associated with a sense of having been fully alive than many more obviously pleasant or exciting events. The relationship between flow and purpose is direct. Flow tends to occur in activities that you are good at and that you care about, activities in which skill and meaning are both present, and in which the challenge is real enough to require genuine engagement. It is, in a sense, what purpose feels like from the inside when it is working perfectly. The simple act of naming what matters to you begins a physiological shift in the brain. This is a finding from affective neuroscience that has implications far beyond the laboratory. When people are asked to name their core values, to actually state, in words, what matters most to them, and then to reflect briefly on those values in the context of their own life, researchers observe measurable changes in the brain's activity and in subsequent behavior. The process, known in psychological research as self-affirmation, does not produce magical transformation, but it does produce consistent and replicable effects. People who engage in the process show reduced threat reactivity in subsequent stressful situations. They show greater openness to information that might otherwise be defended against. They show higher levels of subsequent pro-social behavior and lower levels of self-focused anxiety. The neuroscience suggests that naming one's values activates the brain's reward circuitry and the regions associated with self-referential processing in a way that temporarily increases a person's felt sense of security, coherence, as though the brain, reminded of what it believes in, updates its estimate of its own safety and adequacy. This has practical implications. In moments of anxiety or uncertainty, the act of returning to one's values, not as a performance or an affirmation, but as a genuine act of remembering what matters, is capable of shifting the body's physiological state in ways that increase resilience and clarity. This is part of why many traditions of contemplative practice involve regular acts of recollection, returning, deliberately, to what one holds most sacred, most central, most true. Not because the values change from day to day and need to be reaffirmed, but because the mind drifts, and the drift accumulates, and returning is a practice, not a destination. The indigenous concept of Ubuntu from Southern Africa offers a profound alternative understanding of purpose. Ubuntu is a word from the Nguni Bantu languages of Southern Africa, spoken across countries including South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Zambia. It is often translated as a phrase rather than a single word. I am because we are. Or, more fully, a person is a person through other persons. This is not merely a poetic sentiment. It is a comprehensive philosophy of human identity, purpose, and ethical life. In the Ubuntu worldview, a human being does not exist as a complete, self-sufficient individual who then chooses to enter into relationships with others. The very identity of a person, who they are, what they are capable of, what gives their life meaning, is understood to be fundamentally constituted by their relationships and their community. This is a very different starting point from the individualist traditions dominant in many Western cultures, where purpose tends to be framed as something a solitary individual discovers within themselves and then brings to the world. In the Ubuntu tradition, purpose is not discovered in isolation and then shared. It emerges from the web of relationships itself, from the ways a person is known and called upon and challenged and supported by those around them. There is something in this that resonates deeply with what research has found about the sources of meaning. Psychologists have noted that people who describe their sense of purpose in primarily individualistic terms, I am here to achieve this, to become that, to reach this level of mastery, tend to show more fragile senses of meaning than people who describe their purpose in relational and contributory terms. I am here for these people, to be part of this community, to contribute to something we are building together. The Ubuntu perspective suggests something further, that the separation between the self and the community may itself be somewhat artificial, that who you are is never entirely separable from who you are in relation to, and that a life lived in genuine awareness of this interdependence, in responsive, reciprocal, caring relationship to the people and communities that hold you is not a diminished form of purpose, but perhaps the most authentic form of it. The philosopher and activist Desmond Tutu described Ubuntu as the recognition that my humanity is inextricably caught up in yours, that I can only be fully human to the extent that you are enabled to be fully human. This is not sentimentality. It is an ethical principle with profound practical implications for how we understand what a meaningful life actually looks like. Research into post-traumatic growth reveals that suffering can become one of the most powerful catalysts for deepening purpose. Psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun coined the term post-traumatic growth in the 1990s to describe a phenomenon they had observed repeatedly in their clinical work: that some people who experienced serious trauma, life-threatening illness, the death of a loved one, the collapse of a relationship, severe accident or injury did not merely recover to their prior level of psychological functioning. They arrived, after their recovery, at a different place altogether. A place that was, in important ways, richer and more alive than where they had been before. Post-traumatic growth is not the same as resilience, though it involves resilience. Resilience describes the ability to return to one's prior level of functioning after adversity. Post-traumatic growth describes something that goes beyond prior functioning, a genuine expansion that would not have been possible without the experience of the trauma. People who report post-traumatic growth describe changes that cluster in several consistent areas. They describe stronger and more genuine relationships, having discovered, through crisis, which of their relationships were truly deep and which were superficial. They describe a changed sense of what matters, a reprioritization that cuts through things that previously seemed important and settles more clearly on what actually is. They describe a changed relationship to their own capacity, having survived something they did not know they could survive. They carry a different understanding of their own strength. And many describe a changed or deepened sense of purpose, having been pushed out of the patterns and assumptions of their ordinary life. They found direction they would not otherwise have found. None of this means that trauma is desirable or that its costs are outweighed by its potential transformative effects. Tedeschi and Calhoun are careful to note that post-traumatic growth is not universal, is not linear, and does not erase the suffering from which it emerges. The grief remains grief. The loss remains loss. What changes is what grows alongside them. The relevance to purpose is this: some of the deepest and most durable senses of direction in human life are forged in difficulty. Not because difficulty is the only teacher, but because it strips away the inessential in a way that comfort rarely does. It removes the options, the distractions, the comfortable assumptions, and leaves you with a more direct encounter with what you actually value, what you actually cannot live without, who you actually are when the scaffolding of ordinary life is removed. Some people spend years in quiet and ordinary lives searching for a sense of purpose and never finding it with great clarity. And then, something breaks. And in the breaking, the direction becomes suddenly and unmistakably clear. Not always, but often enough to constitute a recognizable pattern across millions of human lives. The contemplative traditions of the world have long known that stillness and silence are prerequisites for hearing one's deepest direction. This is a theme that runs through virtually every major contemplative tradition in human history, from the Desert Fathers of early Christianity to the Sufi mystics of Islam, from the Zen monks of Japan to the Quaker tradition of silent waiting, from the Hindu practice of dhyana to the Taoist cultivation of Wu Wei. The vocabulary differs enormously, but the underlying conviction is strikingly consistent: that the voice of genuine purpose, the deepest knowing of what one is here for, is quiet, and it cannot be heard over the noise of constant activity and distraction. This is not mysticism divorced from practical reality. It is an observation that a great deal of psychological research has subsequently supported. The process by which people arrive at genuine insight, including insight about their own values, direction, and sense of meaning, relies heavily on what researchers call the default mode network, a set of brain regions that is most active during rest, daydreaming, and internally directed reflection. This network, which was long dismissed as the brain simply idling when not engaged in directed tasks, turns out to be one of the most sophisticated and important networks in the brain. It is the network most associated with self-referential thinking, with the kind of reflection that allows a person to understand themselves, their relationships, and their place in a larger context. It is the network through which people process complex emotional experiences, integrate new information with existing knowledge, and arrive at the kind of synthesis that goes by the name of wisdom. And it requires downtime to function. It cannot do its work when the brain is continuously occupied with incoming information and outgoing demands. It needs the space of genuine rest, of quiet, of letting the mind wander without agenda. This is one reason why so many people report their most important insights about themselves, their direction, their relationships, their values, arriving not during periods of intense, focused effort, but in the shower, on a walk, in the half-awake space between sleeping and rising, in moments of genuine rest. The contemplative traditions knew this. They built entire ways of life around creating and protecting the conditions in which this kind of inner knowing could develop and be heard. And while most people today do not live in monasteries or hermitages, the underlying insight remains as applicable as it has ever been. Stillness is not absence. It is a condition that something in you needs and knows how to use, given the chance. The concept of Ikigai, explored earlier, has a shadow side that is worth sitting with gently. We spoke earlier about Ikigai as a framework for locating purpose at the intersection of what you love, what you are good at, what the world needs, and what you can be sustained by. It is a beautiful framework, and a genuinely useful one. But it is worth noting something about the shadow side of any framework for purpose, including this one. Frameworks, however wise, can become pressures when applied with too much urgency. The same map that is a liberating guide in the hands of someone who holds it lightly can become a source of anxiety in the hands of someone who is convinced they must locate their exact position on it before they can begin to live. Many people encounter ideas about purpose and feel, initially, not inspired, but burdened. The question, "What is my purpose?" can transform, in anxious hands, from an invitation into a demand. A test that must be passed before the real living can begin. And the inability to answer it immediately, the honest recognition that you are not sure, that the picture is not clear, that you are still working it out, becomes evidence of failure rather than simply of being at a particular point in a natural process. This is worth naming because it is common, and because the antidote to it is not different information. It is a different relationship to the question itself. Purpose is not a destination you arrive at and then occupy. It is a quality of orientation, a quality of moving through your life with a genuine sense of what matters, what you are contributing, and where you are headed. This quality can be present even in a great deal of uncertainty about the details, even when the specific shape of your direction is still forming, even when the path ahead is not clear. The relevant question is not, do you have your purpose perfectly mapped? It is whether you are living in honest contact with what genuinely matters to you, whether the choices you are making are genuinely yours, whether you are moving, however imperfectly and however slowly, in the direction that feels most truly alive. That is enough. More than enough. It is, in fact, the whole thing. The science of awe reveals that experiencing something vastly larger than oneself is one of the most reliable paths to felt meaning. Awe is one of the most studied emotions in the new positive psychology, and one of the most interesting. It is defined, in psychological research, as the experience of encountering something vast and difficult to immediately comprehend, something that exceeds your current mental frameworks and prompts a form of expansion or reorganization. Classic awe-inducing experiences include standing at the edge of a Grand Canyon or beneath a towering mountain range, witnessing a severe thunderstorm or the open sea in high weather, looking up at a clear night sky and genuinely reckoning with the distances involved, hearing a piece of music of extraordinary power, standing before a work of art or architecture that somehow exceeds your ability to fully take it in, being present at a birth, being present at a death. What these experiences share is a particular quality of encountering something that is, in some dimension, beyond ordinary scale. And research has found that this quality of encounter, this brush with vastness, has measurable effects on the person who experiences it. People who have recently experienced awe show reduced self-referential thinking, the mental chatter about personal concerns, plans, worries, and comparisons that occupies so much of ordinary mental life. They show increased prosocial behavior, greater generosity, greater cooperativeness, greater willingness to subordinate personal interest to collective well-being. And they consistently report an increase in felt meaning, a sense that their life is part of something larger, that ordinary concerns are less urgent, that what matters has been briefly clarified. Researchers believe that awe produces these effects in part through what they call a shrinking of the self, a temporary reduction in the prominence of the self-concept in awareness. When you are standing at the rim of a vast canyon, the part of your mind that is continuously monitoring your status, your plans, your anxieties, your identity, goes quiet. What remains is something more basic and more expansive, a sense of being present in something much larger than the ordinary self, a sense of connection and belonging that requires no particular story or achievement to justify itself. This experience of awe is one of the most directly and immediately meaningful experiences available to human beings. And it is, in principle, available almost anywhere. Not only at the edge of the Grand Canyon, but in the quality of attention you bring to an ordinary evening sky, in the genuine, curious presence you bring to a conversation with a person whose inner life you have not fully imagined. In the moment when a piece of music or a poem or a painting suddenly pierces through and says something true, awe is not rare. It is waiting, in the ordinary fabric of experience, for the quality of attention that will let it in. Languages shape how purpose is understood, and some languages offer concepts that have no English equivalent. English is a rich language, but it is not the only lens through which human experience has been understood and articulated. There are concepts in other languages that describe aspects of purpose and meaning with a precision and a nuance that English does not quite have words for. Each one points at something real. The German word Weltanschauung, translated roughly as worldview or philosophy of life, refers to the comprehensive framework through which a person understands their place in the world and the values that should govern their life. It is more than a collection of opinions. It is the deep structure of a person's orientation to existence, the lens through which everything else is interpreted. When two people have very different Weltanschauungen, they are not merely disagreeing about facts or preferences. They are looking at the world through entirely different structures of meaning. The Finnish concept of sisu has no clean English equivalent. It refers to something like an inner fire, a quality of stubborn, sustained will in the face of difficulty. Not aggressive or combative, but deeply determined. The willingness to continue when continuing is hard. Not because you are certain of success, but because something in you insists that the effort is worth making. Sisu is often described in the context of endurance, but it is really a description of how a deeply held sense of purpose expresses itself in the face of adversity. The Welsh word hiraeth describes a longing that is also a love specifically, a longing for something you may never have had, or for a home that does not exist in any concrete way. It is often associated with a particular relationship to the past, to one's origins, to a sense of belonging that is both real and irretrievable. For many who experience it, hiraeth is not only painful, it is also meaningful, a form of love, a way of being in profound contact with what one values, even in its absence. The Portuguese concept of saudade is related, a melancholic longing for something deeply loved that is absent, gone, or perhaps never fully possessed. Like hiraeth, it is both an ache and an expression of love. The cultures that have words for these feelings have recognized something important, that love and meaning are sometimes most clearly felt in their absence. That longing, properly understood, is a compass pointing toward what genuinely matters. Each of these concepts opens a small window onto a different way of understanding the relationship between purpose, experience, and the inner life. They remind us that the question of meaning is not a problem to be solved, but a dimension of experience to be inhabited, one that takes different shapes in different lives and cultures, but that is present, in some form, everywhere human beings exist and reflect. The quality of play in childhood reveals something enduring about the nature of intrinsic motivation. Children at play are among the most purposeful beings on earth. This may sound strange, given that play is often understood as the opposite of purposeful activity, as leisure, as recreation, as the absence of serious work. But observe a young child, genuinely absorbed in play, and you are watching something that has all the qualities of deep purpose, total engagement, complete investment, intrinsic motivation with no external reward, a direction that is entirely self-generated and entirely genuine. Researchers who study children's play have been struck by the quality of absorption it involves. Children in genuine self-directed play show many of the features of the adult flow state described by Csikszentmihalyi: complete attention, effortless action, loss of ordinary self-consciousness, and a quality of aliveness that is palpable to observers. The developmental psychologist Stuart Brown, who spent decades studying play across the lifespan, argues that play is not something we outgrow, but something most adults are gradually trained out of. The structures of formal education, professional life, and adult social expectation tend to suppress and narrow the playful engagement with experience that is natural to human beings. That is, in Brown's view, as fundamental to healthy functioning as sleep. Brown identifies several features that define genuine play. It is intrinsically motivated, done for its own sake, not for external reward. It involves a degree of freedom from ordinary constraints and self-consciousness. It has an imaginative quality, an engagement with what could be, not only what is. And it produces a kind of joy that is distinct from ordinary pleasure, not the satisfaction of a need met, but the aliveness of genuine engagement. These are, interestingly, very similar to the qualities that researchers have associated with deeply purposeful activity in adults. The overlap is not coincidental. The playful engagement of childhood and the purposeful engagement of adulthood are not opposites, but expressions of the same underlying human capacity, the capacity for genuine, intrinsically motivated, fully invested engagement with life. Many of the adults who report the strongest and most sustaining senses of purpose are, in some important sense, playing. They have found work or relationships or creative practices that have the quality of genuine play that they do, not because they have to, but because they cannot imagine not doing them. Because they are, in the deepest sense, the things that feel most like themselves. The philosopher Simone de Beauvoir wrote that freedom is not a luxury, but a responsibility, and that making choices is the unavoidable heart of a meaningful life. Simone de Beauvoir was a French existentialist philosopher who spent much of her life and work engaging with the question of what it means to be a free human being in a world that constantly offers reasons not to take that freedom seriously. Her central argument, developed across several major works, was that human beings are inescapably free, not in the sense that they can do anything they wish, but in the sense that they cannot avoid choosing. Even the refusal to choose is a choice. Even the surrender of responsibility to someone else is a choice to surrender it. The attempt to live as though one's values and direction were simply given by tradition, by expectation, by circumstance, is itself a choice to not choose. A choice, as de Beauvoir understood it, against the fundamental nature of human existence. This is a demanding vision. It offers no comfortable escape from the question of purpose. It insists that the question must be engaged, that you cannot simply inherit an answer from your culture or your family or your religion without passing it through your own genuine reflection and making it genuinely your own. But de Beauvoir's vision of freedom is not lonely or cold. It is deeply relational. She argued that genuine freedom cannot be achieved in isolation, that a person who is free while others around them are constrained has not fully achieved freedom, but only a partial and incomplete version of it. True freedom is something that must be created together, in conditions of mutual recognition and mutual care. This relational dimension of freedom connects to the question of purpose in an important way. A purpose that is genuinely yours, one you have arrived at through honest reflection rather than external conformity, is not one that puts you in opposition to others. It is one that connects you more fully to them. Because genuine purpose, as we have explored throughout this evening, tends to flow toward contribution, toward the expression of your particular gifts and capacities in ways that serve the well-being of others and the world. Freedom and purpose, in de Beauvoir's vision, are not competing values, but mutually sustaining ones. The person who is genuinely free, who takes genuine responsibility for their own direction and values, is thereby more capable of genuine contribution to the freedom and flourishing of others. Research finds that the language people use to describe their own lives shapes the sense of meaning they are able to find in them. This is a finding from narrative psychology, a branch of psychological research that studies the stories people tell about their own lives and how those stories influence their experience, their choices, and their well-being. People naturally structure their life experience in narrative form. We are storytelling creatures, and we cannot help imposing narrative shape on the events of our lives, connecting them into sequences of cause and effect, threading them onto themes and arcs, framing them as journeys with directions and meanings. Researchers like Dan McAdams, who has spent decades studying what he calls the personal narrative, the story each person constructs and carries about who they are and where they came from, have found that the kind of story a person tells profoundly shapes their psychological well-being and sense of meaning. People who construct what McAdams calls redemptive narratives, stories in which suffering and setback are woven into a larger arc that moves toward growth, contribution, and meaning, show higher levels of psychological well-being, greater sense of purpose, and more sustained generative engagement with others compared to people who construct what he calls contamination narratives, stories in which good things tend to turn bad, in which setback is the dominant theme, in which the arc of experience is mostly downward. This does not mean that optimism is simply a choice, or that people who suffer most should simply think differently. The research is more nuanced than that. It acknowledges that some circumstances are genuinely very difficult, and that the life experiences people have had are real and formative, and not simply a matter of reframing. But it does suggest something meaningful about the power of narrative agency, the degree to which a person actively shapes the story they tell about their own life, rather than simply receiving that story from others or from circumstance. People who are able to author their own life story, who approach their experience as something they are narrating rather than simply experiencing passively, tend to find more meaning in it, even in its most difficult passages. This is one reason why practices like reflective journaling, talking with a trusted person about one's experience, or engaging in therapy can be so valuable for the sense of meaning. They are all, in different ways, practices of narrative authorship. They create the conditions in which a person can actively engage with the story of their own life, can look at what has happened, find the thread running through it, and exercise some genuine say in how the story continues. The mathematician and philosopher Blaise Pascal observed that all of human unhappiness stems from a single cause: the inability to sit quietly in a room alone. Pascal was writing in the 17th century, but his observation has lost none of its relevance. If anything, it has grown more pointed with each passing decade, as the density and velocity of external stimulation available to any given human being has increased. What Pascal was pointing at was the relationship between the capacity for solitude and the capacity for genuine self-knowledge, including the self-knowledge that is prerequisite for understanding what one is here for and what one genuinely values. His claim was not that all unhappiness can be eliminated by sitting quietly. It was that a specific and very common form of unhappiness, the restlessness, the anxiety, the sense of dissatisfaction that no external experience seems to permanently address, arises from the flight from oneself. The inability to be alone, or rather, the inability to be genuinely present with oneself, in the quiet that solitude offers, means that the internal signals that carry genuine information about one's values, inclinations, and direction cannot be heard above the noise. The person in constant flight from their own interior never quite knows what they actually think, feel, or want at the deepest level. And so they continue searching outward for the next experience, the next relationship, the next achievement, for something that can only be found by turning inward. This is not an argument for a life of solitude or for withdrawal from the richness of external engagement. It is an argument for balance, for the cultivation of an inner life rich and secure enough to be lived in, not merely escaped from, for the practice of being, on a regular basis, genuinely alone with oneself, not filled with entertainment or distraction, but genuinely present with the quiet and willing to listen to what it says. Purpose, as a quiet signal from the deepest part of oneself, requires this kind of listening. It is not loud. It does not announce itself with fanfare. It tends to speak in the register of felt inclination, of recurring interest, of things that call to you in your quieter moments. And it can be heard, reliably, only by someone who has developed the capacity and the habit of being still enough to notice. Across every major civilizational tradition, service to others has been described as the highest expression of a meaningful life. This is perhaps the most consistent finding across the widest range of human wisdom traditions. Not the accumulation of wealth, not the achievement of power or fame or recognition, not even the cultivation of personal virtue in isolation, but service, the genuine, freely given, caring engagement with the needs and well-being of others as the highest and most fully realized expression of human purpose. This appears in every major religious tradition without exception. In Christianity, the highest commandments are to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself, with the second of these understood not as sentiment, but as active, practical care. In Islam, the concept of sadaqah, voluntary charity and service to others, is described as one of the most spiritually significant acts a person can perform. In Buddhism, the bodhisattva, the one who has developed the capacity for enlightenment and chooses to remain in the world for the sake of alleviating the suffering of all beings, is the ideal of the highest spiritual development. In Judaism, tikkun olam, the repair of the world, is a central ethical concept describing the human responsibility to actively work toward the healing of what is broken in the world. Secular traditions arrive at similar conclusions by different routes. The utilitarian philosophers argued that the goal of a meaningful life was to produce the greatest well-being for the greatest number of people. The humanist tradition places service to the development of human dignity and freedom at the center of the good life. Contemporary positive psychology finds, in study after study, that other-directed behavior, generosity, care, contribution to the well-being of others is among the most reliable predictors of felt meaning and life satisfaction. There is something here worth sitting with, not as a demand or a pressure, but as an observation. The most fulfilling lives across virtually every tradition that has looked carefully at the question are the ones most genuinely oriented toward others. Not oriented toward others at the expense of oneself, that road leads to burnout and resentment, but genuinely oriented, caring about the well-being of specific other people and about the broader conditions that allow human beings to flourish. This is not a coincidence. It reflects something deep about what human beings are. We are social creatures, evolved for interdependence. Our deepest satisfactions are relational ones. And the life that has found a genuine way to contribute, to offer something of genuine value to the lives of other people, however small and quiet and unremarked, is the life that tends, in the end, to feel most worth having lived. The quality of your attention in ordinary moments is where purpose is most often practiced and most quietly found. We began tonight with a large and ancient question, and we have wandered through philosophy and neuroscience, through history and psychology, through poetry and contemplative tradition, through research and reflection, gathering as we went a picture of purpose that is both vast and intimate. In its vastness, purpose is connected to the longest questions human beings have ever asked, to the evolutionary origins of the human capacity for meaning, to the philosophical traditions of every civilization, to the neuroscience of what the brain most deeply needs, to the spiritual intuitions of every major tradition that has ever tried to understand what human life is for. In its intimacy, purpose is as close as the next moment, as available as the quality of attention you bring to whoever is in front of you right now, as immediate as the small choice, made 100 times a day, between genuine engagement and habitual distraction, as near as the act of pausing for just a moment to notice what actually matters to you before you decide how to spend the next hour of your life. These are not grand gestures, they are ordinary moments. The ordinary moments of which every life is made, and in the quality of presence and care with which they are inhabited, a life of genuine purpose is either constructed or missed. The research, the philosophy, the ancient wisdom, and the testimony of people reflecting on long lives all point in the same direction. Purpose is not something that lives in the future, waiting to be found after the current circumstances are resolved. It lives in the present moment, in the relationship you are already in, and how fully you are inhabiting it, in the work you are already doing, and how much genuine care you bring to it, in the values you already hold, and how honestly and courageously you are choosing to live by them. You do not need to have all the answers. You only need to stay honest, stay curious, and stay oriented toward what genuinely matters. The rest, as Rilke promised, will be lived into, in time, whether you notice it arriving or not. Psychologists studying the relationship between gratitude and meaning have found they are deeply interwoven. Gratitude and meaning, though distinct, appear to support and reinforce one another in ways that are consistent and measurable. Research finds that gratitude, the genuine, reflective acknowledgement of what is good and valuable in one's life, is one of the most reliable routes into a felt sense of meaning, even in the absence of any other change in circumstances. This is because gratitude does something unusual to the relationship between a person and their own experience. Ordinary experience, encountered in a state of taking for granted, tends to be invisible. The familiar becomes background. The reliable becomes assumed. The good that is consistently present stops registering as good and simply becomes the water in which you swim. Gratitude interrupts this invisibility. It brings what was background into the foreground. It restores what was taken for granted to the status of a gift. And in doing so, it changes the felt quality of a life without changing any of its external features. People who practice deliberate, reflective gratitude, who take time regularly to name specific things they are genuinely grateful for, and to sit with that gratitude for a moment, report higher levels of meaning, greater life satisfaction, and a stronger sense of connection to others. They sleep better. They show greater persistence in pursuing their goals. They are more generous and more likely to help others. The mechanism involves, in part, a shift in attentional focus. Gratitude directs attention toward what is good and present, rather than toward what is lacking or threatening. And what attention touches tends to grow in significance, so that the things a person is grateful for become more prominent in their ongoing experience of their life. But there is something more than attentional retraining at work. The practice of gratitude also involves a recognition of interconnection, an acknowledgement that the good in one's life has arrived through others, through circumstance, through the efforts and care of people known and unknown. It is inherently relational. And in that recognition of relatedness, in the felt sense of being embedded in a web of gifts received and given, something that is very close to the heart of meaning is touched. Psychologists have found that altruism, acting for the genuine benefit of others, is one of the most reliable sources of felt meaning. This is a finding that tends to surprise people who have absorbed the cultural message that selfishness is natural and altruism is somehow against the grain of human nature. The data suggests something different. When people help others in ways that are genuinely experienced as voluntary, not compelled by guilt or obligation, but freely chosen, they reliably report an increase in felt well-being that researchers have called the helper's high. This effect is measurable in self-report, in neurological activity, and in physiological markers. The effect of giving, of contributing to the well-being of another person or a cause on the giver's own sense of meaning is particularly striking. Studies find that even brief, anonymous acts of generosity, giving money to a stranger, helping someone who will never know who helped them, produce increases in felt meaning that persist beyond the immediate moment. Researchers believe this reflects the deeply social nature of human biology. Human beings evolved in conditions where cooperation was essential to survival, and where the health of the community was inseparable from the health of the individual. The brain appears to be wired to reward cooperative and generous behavior, to signal, through the experience of meaning and positive emotion, that this is the right kind of thing to be doing. This does not mean that all altruism is motivated by self-interest. The reward comes after the act, not before it, and is therefore rarely a conscious motive in genuine generosity. But it does suggest that the philosophical argument between self-interest and other regarding values may be less of a genuine conflict than it appears. A life lived in genuine service of others turns out to be, by the evidence of both neuroscience and long-term well-being research, also a life well lived for oneself. The historian and philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn, observed that the most transformative shifts in understanding often arrive from the margins. Thomas Kuhn wrote about paradigm shifts in science, the moments when the accumulated anomalies within a dominant framework of understanding become impossible to ignore, and a new framework must be constructed. But his observation applies more broadly to the question of purpose. The most meaningful changes in a person's sense of direction often arrive not from the center of their established life, but from the margins. A chance encounter, an unexpected loss that opens a space. A book read at the right moment that says something you didn't know you needed to hear. A conversation with a stranger on a train that somehow cuts through to something real. A period of illness or incapacity that removes the noise of busyness and leaves you with nothing but yourself and your own thoughts. These marginal experiences, the ones that arrive sideways, uninvited, apparently minor, are frequently the points at which something important shifts in a person's understanding of what their life is for. They can reorganize a life around a new center. Not always dramatically, but often enough that when people tell the story of how they found their direction, there is frequently something accidental near the beginning, something they did not plan for. This is worth knowing. It suggests that purpose is not only found through deliberate searching, through retreats and workshops and careful self-analysis, but also through the quality of one's attentiveness to ordinary experience, through being sufficiently present in the moments of one's actual life to notice when something unexpected arrives and says, "Pay attention to this, this matters." Older people, when asked what they wish they had known earlier about meaning, rarely describe achievements they wish they had pursued. This is one of the most consistent and quietly sobering findings in the research on aging and retrospective meaning. When people in their later years are asked to reflect on their lives and to describe what they believe would have made their lives more meaningful, they almost never describe professional achievements they didn't reach. They almost never describe wealth they didn't accumulate or recognition they didn't receive. They describe relationships. They describe time. They describe presence in the moments that mattered. They describe wishing they had worried less, had spent less time preoccupied with things that, from the perspective of a longer life, turned out not to matter much, had been more present in ordinary moments, in the ordinary conversations, in the ordinary evenings, in the ordinary and entirely unrepeatable texture of the daily life they were living while they were busy imagining a more meaningful future. They describe wishes for more courage, more honesty in their relationships, more willingness to pursue what genuinely interested them rather than what they thought they were supposed to pursue. They describe gratitude for the things they almost missed, for the person they almost didn't talk to, for the moment of beauty they almost walked past too quickly to notice. These are not findings from particularly dramatic or difficult lives. They are the findings of ordinary lives, reviewed from the vantage point of age and accumulated experience. And what they suggest, collectively, is that the sources of a meaningful life are more accessible, more present, and more quietly extraordinary than the larger cultural conversation about success and achievement tends to imply. They are here, in the ordinary fabric of your life, right now, in the relationships you have and the ones you could deepen, in the values you hold and the small daily choices through which you express them, in the moments of genuine attention you bring to the people and the tasks and the experiences that are actually in front of you. The Japanese forest bathing tradition of Shinrin-yoku reveals how connection to nature can restore a sense of meaning. In Japan, a practice known as Shinrin-yoku, which translates roughly as forest bathing, has been part of health and well-being culture since the early 1980s. It does not involve vigorous hiking or physical activity. It involves simply being in the presence of a forest, walking slowly, breathing deliberately, attending to the sensory richness of the natural environment with a quality of unhurried, receptive presence. Research into the effects of this practice has produced findings that many people find surprising. Time spent in natural environments, particularly forested ones, produces measurable reductions in cortisol levels, blood pressure, and heart rate. It is associated with increased activity in the parasympathetic nervous system, the part of the nervous system associated with rest, recovery, and what some researchers call the tend and befriend response. It consistently produces improvements in mood, reductions in rumination, and increases in reports of felt meaning and connectedness. Researchers have proposed various mechanisms, the particular patterns of visual complexity found in natural environments, the fractals of leaf and branch, the non-repeating patterns of light and shadow, appear to engage the visual system in a way that is simultaneously stimulating and calming, reducing the kind of mental fatigue that results from sustained attentional effort. The microbial diversity of forest environments may play a role through the immune system. The simple fact of being somewhere that has existed for a very long time, that is entirely indifferent to human concerns and anxieties, appears to produce a kind of perspective that reduces the urgency of whatever was most occupying the mind. But beyond the physiological mechanisms, there is something else in the reports of people who practice Shinrin-yoku. They speak of a sense of being held, of feeling, for a while, part of something very old and very large, of their ordinary concerns becoming temporarily small in a way that is not frightening but deeply relieving. This sense of being embedded in something larger than oneself, of belonging not only to one's immediate human community, but to the living world more broadly, is one of the experiences that researchers associate most consistently with the deepest forms of felt meaning. The experience of what some call transcendence, the momentary dissolution of the ordinary boundaries between the self and the world, the recognition that you are not separate from the living fabric of existence, but genuinely, deeply part of it. The poet Rilke wrote that we should try to love the questions themselves. Rainer Maria Rilke was an Austrian poet of the late 19th and early 20th century, whose letters and poems continue to be read around the world today. In a series of letters to a young poet, published under the title Letters to a Young Poet, he offered advice that was, in its quiet way, radical. "Do not seek the answers right now," he wrote, "because you would not be able to live them. And the point is, to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps then, someday far in the future, you will gradually, without even noticing it, live your way into the answer." This is not advice to give up on finding answers. It is something more subtle. It is the recognition that some of the most important questions, including the question of what your life is for, what you are here to contribute, who you most deeply are, cannot be answered by thinking about them alone. They must be lived into. They require experience, patience, and a willingness to remain in the uncertainty of not yet knowing without collapsing into either false certainty or despair. The person who demands an immediate and final answer to the question of their purpose, who insists on resolution before they can move forward, often finds themselves paralyzed. The question itself becomes a barrier rather than an invitation, because the question of purpose is not the kind of question that yields to direct assault. It is the kind of question that yields, slowly and sideways, to the accumulation of genuine living. You live forward, you look backward, and what you see, looking backward, is often a direction you were already moving in, more clearly than you realized at the time. The experience of beauty has been recognized across cultures as one of the most immediate and accessible pathways into a sense that life is meaningful. Beauty is one of the oldest human preoccupations. Long before recorded history, human beings were making things that served no purely practical function, painting the walls of caves, carving figures from stone, arranging objects with a care for symmetry and form that was not required by survival. The impulse toward beauty appears to be among the most ancient and most universal features of human behavior. Philosophers have debated for centuries what beauty is and why it matters. But psychologists, studying the experience of beauty from the inside, the subjective experience of encountering something beautiful, have found something consistent and interesting. The experience of beauty is closely associated with the experience of meaning. When people report powerful encounters with beauty, a landscape, a piece of music, a work of art, a human face or gesture that strikes them as deeply beautiful, they consistently describe a sense that something important has been touched, that something true has been recognized, that the world has revealed, in that moment, a depth or a significance that is not always visible. The philosopher Iris Murdoch, who thought deeply about the relationship between beauty and goodness, argued that the experience of beauty involves a temporary movement away from the self. When you are genuinely arrested by something beautiful, she suggested, the ordinary self-absorbed chatter of the mind goes quiet. You are looking outward, not inward. You are attending to something other than your own concerns and anxieties. And in that moment of genuine, selfless attention to something beautiful, you are also practicing a kind of moral perception, the capacity to see what is actually there, rather than what you want or fear to be there. This connection between beauty and meaning runs through virtually every contemplative and aesthetic tradition in human history. The Japanese aesthetic concept of mono no aware, roughly a sensitivity to the transience of things and a gentle sadness at their passing, locates beauty not in permanence, but in impermanence. In the recognition that something is beautiful partly because it will not last, the cherry blossom is beautiful in this tradition, not despite its brevity, but because of it. And in encountering that beauty, one is encountering something true about the nature of existence itself. Beauty, understood in this way, is not an ornament to a meaningful life. It is one of its most direct expressions. The capacity to be genuinely moved by what is beautiful in nature, in art, in other people, in the small and ordinary and daily textures of a life lived with some quality of attention, is itself a form of purpose. A form of being present to what matters. There is something in the human spirit that is oriented, by nature, toward becoming. This is perhaps the deepest finding of all the research, philosophy, and human experience we have wandered through tonight. Not toward arriving, not toward completing, not toward having finished, but toward becoming. The most enduring sources of meaning are not those attached to static achievements, the title, the possession, the recognition that, once reached, sits there and no longer generates the aliveness it promised. They are the ones attached to ongoing processes, to the relationship that is still deepening, to the craft that is still being refined, to the understanding that is still growing, to the person one is still in the process of becoming. The developmental psychologist Abraham Maslow, who mapped a hierarchy of human needs from physiological survival to what he called self-actualization, described the self-actualizing person not as one who had reached a pinnacle, but as one who was genuinely oriented toward growth, engaged with the ongoing project of becoming more fully themselves. Not because they were dissatisfied with what they were, but because growth was their nature, and living against nature is the one thing that consistently generates a feeling of meaninglessness, regardless of what else is present. This is comforting, because it means that the question of purpose is never really finished. It does not have a final answer you must find before you can begin. It is answered day by day in the direction you are pointing, in the values you are choosing to live by, in the small, ordinary, daily practice of moving toward what genuinely matters to you. And that practice is available in every moment. In this moment, in the quiet space between waking and sleeping, in the pause before the next thought arrives. And so, dear listener, as we draw our gentle wandering to a close, let us rest for a moment in everything we have gathered. We began with the oldest question, the one human beings have carried since long before cities or calendars or written language. The question of what this life is for. And we have found not a single answer, but a constellation of truths. each one pointing in the same general direction, each one illuminated slightly differently by the light of science, or philosophy, or tradition, or the quiet testimony of human experience. We found that meaning is not a luxury added to life, but a biological need woven into the very structure of the brain. That purpose shows up in the body as a state of alert ease, that particular quality of being both present and calm. That the search for purpose is not something you do once, but a way of orienting to your own life, a daily practice, a direction of attention, a quality of listening. We found that the most enduring sources of meaning run toward other people, toward genuine contribution, toward the honest expression of what you actually value. We found that difficulty, held in the context of something genuinely cared for, is frequently where the deepest meaning lives. We found that boredom is a compass, that attention is a form of love, that legacy is a quietly universal human impulse, and that the wisest reflection on a life well lived almost always points toward presence, relationship, and honest alignment with one's own deepest values. And we found, perhaps most importantly, that you do not need to have your purpose perfectly articulated before you can begin living purposefully. You only need to be honest, to stay curious, to pay genuine attention to the things that light you up and the things that drain you, to move with whatever care and honesty you can manage toward what genuinely matters to you, and to be willing to live the question, as Rilke said, all the way into the answer. Your life is already full of meaning that you may not have named yet. The people you love, the things you do with care, the quiet ways you contribute that no one may ever formally acknowledge. The moments of genuine presence that you offer to whoever and whatever is in front of you. These are not small things waiting to be replaced by something more important. They are, in the deepest sense, the whole thing. As you lie here now, letting your breath settle and your muscles release, let all of it settle too, the questions and the partial answers. The direction you are already moving in, even when you cannot see it clearly. The long, patient, gentle work of becoming more fully yourself. The night is quiet. There is nothing required of you in this moment. Only rest. Only the soft, unhurried dissolution of the day into sleep. You are here. That is enough. It has always been enough. And in ways both small and large, known and unknown, visible and entirely invisible to you, your being here matters. Let that be the last thought as your eyes grow heavier and the world grows softer. Let it be the thought that carries you gently into the dark and restful quiet of sleep. Good night.